Welcome back to Accessibility Unlocked, the podcast where we break down accessibility regulations, real world challenges, and practical strategies to make digital content usable for everyone. I'm your host, Vijayashri. Most people call me VJ. Today, we're going to be talking to Don Torres, and today's episode is part one of a two-part series focused on digital accessibility under Title 2 of the ADA and what the DOJ's, which is the Department of Justice, final rule means for state and local governments. Before we dive in, I wanted to just share a summary of what we're going to be discussing today. In part one, we're going to be focusing on what is Title II exactly, how the Department of Justice 2024 final rule means, and how it impacts websites and digital documents. Then in part two, we'll kind of go deeper into policy and planning, implementation strategies, training, enforcement outlook, and then what governments should be doing right now. And to start with some brief introductions, I'm VJ. I am SVP Growth and Strategy with Continual Engine. Continual Engine is an AI technology company with a suite of award winning products that help make digital accessibility a lot faster and scalable and cost effective. And joining me today is Don Torres, an industry veteran who's been building accessibility partnerships and helping organizations navigate compliance for years. Don, thank you so much for being here, and I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's a privilege to be here to talk about this. I've been working for the better part of the last decade on digital accessibility, and my primary focus has been government and K through 12 schools. But really, with a focus on government, I've worked with hundreds of governments to help them become accessible. I'm really passionate about this, and I'm happy to be speaking with you about this today.
Great. Don, thank you so much. And so, one of the things that I like to start with is just what is Accessibility Unlocked? And for those who are new, Accessibility Unlocked is about cutting through the noise. We are speaking about how accessibility impacts people, companies, organizations, governments. And we, as much as possible, try to include real world guidance for the people who are actually responsible for digital content, as well as websites, documents, and services. And I want to start with a very brief story of how I met Don, because it's always wonderful to meet people in the industry, but it's usually not as simple as it was. And so, Don, before we get into the legal side, I'd love to start with the back story of how our paths crossed and also what brought you into the space. So I want to, have you maybe talk a little bit about it.
I don't remember how we met.
Okay, I'll
I,
refresh
I
your
feel
memory.
like we've known each. I've been very aware of Continual Engine for a long time.
Great. So I actually learned about your work through a colleague of mine who pointed me to some of your resources and some of the work you've been doing. And so I literally just messaged you on LinkedIn and you responded, which doesn't always happen on LinkedIn because people are, wary of someone soliciting, especially from organizations that are doing work in the space. So I really appreciated your openness. And what struck me was just your passion about accessibility. Of course, most people in the space are here for the reason that it matters to them. They care about the topic, and they are invested. But it's very nice to meet someone who is thinking about practical applications because there is a degree of impact that you can bring when you talk about actually what you can do, what is within control of companies or individuals when they are taking action in the space of digital accessibility. So I really appreciated your jumping in very quickly into the implementation side of things and talking about practical strategies, which again, we're going to continue to talk about today. But yeah, just to refresh our memories on how we went.
That was great, and I love talking with people who are passionate about this, who, as you say, do the right things for the right reasons, and it's just been great to meet you and the way that Continual Engine does things, and I look forward to our increased partnership.
Likewise. And so one of the pieces that I want to just speak to is why are we here? So at my company, in my role, I lead growth at Continual Engine, And a lot of what we are actively involved in is how can we embed our accessibility automation with human experts and remediation for the government, local government, and state governments who are trying to work towards Title II compliance, especially in the context of documents and website and digital content. In addition, we do work quite widely with higher ed, publishers, enterprises, everyone who is at this point looking at their content through the lens of Title II. And again, Don, your work really connects with that mission. So I wanted to definitely have you as part of Accessibility Unlocked. And today's topic is going to be Title II, digital accessibility, and what the DOJ final rule means for government websites and documents. So let's start with a foundation question because often we assume everyone knows what everything is about, including Title II, and it's always helpful to take a step back and start at the ground. So, Don, can you give our listeners a very quick overview of Title II of the ADA and why it's particularly relevant for digital accessibility in both state and local governments?
Absolutely. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed by Congress in 1990, and that dealt with just open access to all programs and services, whether that's, retail or local government and state government. But it was separated into five titles, and Title II is specifically with regard to total with local government and all governments actually. State and local government are under Title II. And what that means is all programs and services must be accessible to everyone, and you can't discriminate on the basis of disability. And that was wide reaching, and it doesn't mention websites because it was passed in 1990. So it's broad. It's basically just says anything that the local government does must be accessible to everyone.
And so that kind of leads me to the next question. So, with the content, we hear a lot of our prospective clients as well as partners that we work with talk quite widely about websites because websites is prominently featured. So, can you speak a little bit to the final rule that was published in April 2024, which was specifically related to Title II for websites? What does that mean for local government websites today, based on what is coming up in the deadlines in April 2026 as well as in 2027?
This is an excellent question because the interpretation of Title II and the ADA evolved over time. There's been a lot of discussion about whether it applies to websites. It's largely accepted now that it does, particularly with government. Your city hall is now a digital city hall on the website, and people want to do business via the web more and more all the time. And so that enforcement is really important and the interpretation is important. This has always been the law. It's always been something that local governments need to do and enforced by the Department of Justice. However, in April 2024, the Department of Justice issued their final warning that said they will begin to enforce this. They named the standard of web content accessibility guidelines and gave deadlines of 2 years for large governments and 3 years for smaller governments. So that's defined as 50,000. That's where the law was drawn. If you've worked in local government for a while, you probably know that 50,000 is not large. I mean,
Right,
not the way that we typically think about it now.
right.
And so, really, the deadline, because we said 2 years, is this April. So, there's only a few months for large organizations to comply before the DOJ can enforce this. And small governments will get to see how the model is done for large governments as well. But I do want to mention that special districts fall under small local governments. So if you're a water district or a fire district, even if you're in a large county or city, you are considered for this enforcement as a small government. So that's basically what it says and when it can be enforced.
Great. And Don, to kind of build on that question, when we talk about websites, it's any public facing website, basically managed and hosted directly by the government organization. Is that correct?
That is, and I'll go a step further. I'm glad that you clarified because it's all software. So if you've got software that is for your Parks and Rec organization or your clerk organization where all of your meeting minutes and agendas are set, it doesn't even really need to be a website. If it's software that's used to access your programs and services, it must be accessible. And like you said, public facing.
And apps as well that might be on
Yes,
your phone, whatever that you have, and you're pulling it up for a quick something about, public information that would also be included as part of this.
that's right.
And these are questions that we like to clarify because it often gets missed when we talk about this. And so the part that I liked that you mentioned was the WCAG 2.1 AA. The rule references this as the standard for a city, county, or school district. What does that actually mean in practical terms? What are they undertaking?
Well, web content accessibility guidelines are published by an international organization that debates them and discusses them heavily. There's about 80 criteria. Most of them are pass fail, and it's really difficult for a local government leader to have their handle on all of those criteria. But it's an important question to say how they look at it, because I think that ultimately our true north is that we want all people to be able to access uh, goods and the programs and services by the local government. So there are
Yeah.
some ways to really look at this and make sure that you're reaching your community, including those people who are disabled. But Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is the guideline, and it's important that the federal government named a standard. This deals with things like font size and how you can expand it, reading level, color contrast, does a screen reader, which allows people with visual disabilities to hear your website, what's expressed visually, how that works. So it's very comprehensive, but in practical terms, that's what it means is what programs and services do you offer? Can people with disabilities access it?
And then how much of this do you believe at this point, and just as a anecdotal without really having, to get into data unless you have it, is really how well supported are these organizations, which includes, city, county, school districts, local and state governments? How well supported are they internally from a expertise standpoint? Because in my experience and being in this space for, and I still think I'm young in this space for about 7 or 8 years, is essentially understanding that there's quite a lot of technical nuances to WCAG. And even with, obviously a really well charted plan and with having a consultant maybe give you a head start with some knowledge base in terms of having the ability to implement it, how well positioned do you think these organizations are?
Most of them have not been well positioned. Budgets are strapped. Most local governments don't have a budget for accessibility beyond construction, where you would set up a wheelchair ramp or widen entries and spaces. A lot of them haven't considered digital accessibility yet. So there's not much budget. A lot of local government leaders don't have the expertise. I mean, there's not a person dedicated to accessibility unless they get much bigger. The Department of Justice requires an accessibility coordinator, but it doesn't have to be someone's full-time job. So usually they're wearing lots of hats, including
Yeah.
accessibility coordinator. And so they're not very well equipped for this. And it does help to have expert attention and partnerships.
And I also like the fact that I particularly kind of want to go back to what you were saying about the model, starting with larger government organizations, and then having a model that the smaller uh, state and local government organizations can kind of follow. And so that does a little bit come to budget because larger government organizations tend to be typically, not always, better funded. And they tend to typically, again, not always, have a little bit more access to resources. So, again, that feels just looking at what the Title II requires at this point, like a logical extension of saying, let's start with where there is most impact, where there is a little bit more funding, and then use that to build out a plan or a roadmap for smaller organizations that, of course, still have impact, but maybe it is to a smaller degree, but might need a little bit more support along the way because they don't have access to resources. Would that be accurate to say as just something that I'm reading into how this is laid out?
I think it's absolutely accurate. This is an unfunded mandate, so there's not a lot of grant money for it. And
Yeah.
so the importance of what the federal government did with this DOJ announcement is really rallied people, because Most local governments that I've talked to, and I've talked to hundreds of them, they want to do the right thing. They want to have accessible technology. They don't know how because it's been a while since they've, studied that. They don't have the budgets for it. And so the government enabled a lot of prioritization for this, so there are more resources. But like you say, large governments are leading the way because they've got more resources and more impact, right? I mean, they
Yes.
hear from their community strongly and they're able to prioritize this and work on it. It's going to be a real, they're going to lead the way for smaller governments to learn how this is done and enforced.
Yeah, and again, that feels very promising, especially because I kind of want to move to a common area of concern that comes up frequently in either questions or trying to budget and plan, which is legacy content. So because this has been around a little bit, but not, is still, I would say, recent in enforcement, um, the typical government website tends to have a lot of legacy content, whether it's old pages, PDFs, forms. And I know that there is a level of tolerance to uh, like actively content that's not actively used. But how does the DOJ rule address pre-existing web pages and documents, if you can speak to that, Don?
I can. There are five exceptions under the DOJ rule. And those exceptions are not meant to exclude any content, but it really helps governments focus on what they do need to update for accessibility. Archived web content is accepted. So if you've got years and years of financial reports and meeting minutes for city council, those don't need to be updated before the deadline. Pre-existing documents, like documents that have been around for a while, can also be archived. I recommend that local governments set up an archive and move content there. Now, if it's those documents are being used for current program or service access, it doesn't matter how old they are, that must be accessible. But content hosted by a third party, conventional electronic documents that are personal, like if I can access my property taxes through a portal, that is accepted and doesn't need to be accessible right away unless someone asks for it. And then
Sure.
pre-existing social media posts. So basically, what it's saying is if it's old and doesn't access programs or services directly, it's accepted. Everything else needs to be focused on and made accessible.
So anything that's being actively used, referenced, that is important for public to have access in order to procure services or make requests, all of those need to be made accessible. However, if you have something that's just like you called out meeting minutes, that's years old, and that is not being used, it's not being referenced, and does not really feature in anything that's current, those can be moved to archive.
Absolutely.
Great. And one of the things that we hear, and this is again just from our conversations with in companies in the space, is there is a rush to move a lot more to archived. Is there any oversight that happens over time with these? Like, so say, let's assume a bunch of things is in archived, but some of it is being used. Do you see that as a risk for local and state governments to make that call? Of course, in the interest of feeling like they have a little bit more of a handle on the situation.
I think it is a risk. It's important to know state laws because state laws will mandate how long you have to leave something public facing. I think it might be important too for a lot of local governments to understand that because you don't have to have everything public facing. So you can put 10-year-old documents behind, a firewall that's not public facing, and then through Freedom of Information Act, people can ask for it. Then
Yeah.
once they do, you can make that specific document accessible and forward facing to the public. So really what it's doing is helping local governments focus on the programs and services currently. I think that we had a mindset for a long time that everything that was available needed to be public facing. We're kind of shifting away from that because most people interact with their government to do something, and that's what's important for this ruling.
Yeah, and I want to kind of go a little bit more into websites before we move to documents, although documents is a favorite topic for us. From your experience, what would you say are the most common website accessibility barriers that you see? Because again, you mentioned it's anything that's hosted and maintained by a state or local government. And how do you see that these organizations can start fixing them efficiently? Because it can be for some a larger undertaking than for others.
The most common errors are that your website won't read with a screen reader. which again is how people with visual disabilities interpret your website. So you'll have buttons that don't have alternative tags, and so the screen reader will jump right over it. That is a common error. Color contrast is hugely common, where you've got links that are really hard to read because they're on similar color to the background. And so that's an issue for people who are colorblind, but it's also an issue for people with visual acuity error or issues, who I have old eyes. So sometimes if there's color contrast issues, I can't see the links. Those are pretty common. Another one is navigation. If your page is hard to navigate to, or it can't get to certain content without a mouse, not everyone can use a mouse for, the acuity and choosing of where they want to go. So your page needs to be able to be navigated without keyboard traps or getting stuck or able to navigate. There's a lot of issues. Those are the most common. I think if I was going to name another one, it would be video captions that are just
Yeah.
bad. And then you asked about how they can help navigate that. There's a lot of tools online that can help you at least get your arms around a problem. I will say anything automated will have issues. There's argument over how accurate they are, but everyone knows they're not 100% accurate. So you'll need a
Yeah.
human being to test it. And those things that I named are fairly easy to at least get started with testing and see if you have a problem. But most local governments need to do an internal assessment and know if their websites work.
So the starting point, if I can again extrapolate from what you're saying, is to first know what are your issues, to know what are your challenges. So then you can have a game plan. And I totally agree. Being in this space and looking at automation through actually great automation tools that are out there, it still has limitations. And while that's a very good starting point, definitely gives you a good assessment, it isn't going to be a fix all. So, yeah, I like the idea of what you're discussing, which is prioritization, understanding what needs to be fixed, what are your issues that are going to be causing the greatest challenges for people to access your websites, and also to consider having someone who has expertise in this space to support and make sure that you are not just undertaking the accessibility, but also testing to make sure that it's correctly implemented.
Absolutely. And I will elaborate on that and say artificial intelligence is a game changer. It's making these scanning and automated tools much more accurate. You will always need a human being at the end of the testing to look at it because this is a human issue. And we're
Yeah.
discussing limitations that human beings have. So there's no substitute. You cannot just do an automated scan and be done with accessibility.
Yeah, and actually that really segues very nicely into my next question. That was about user testing. Um, Again, I can't underscore the importance of testing with real users because this is really our work in the space for anyone who is working in accessibility, who's undertaking accessibility in whatever capacity. It is about connecting with the end user who are impacted by whatever you're introducing, either whether it's accessible or inaccessible content, and having them in the loop. And we do that. We encourage it. We regularly have conversations with our end users who are native screen reader users to get that perspective, which is invaluable because regardless of however great your tools are and however great your testers are, the very critical, I would say, missing component to a lot of good work tends to be, including ongoing testing with real users, including people with disabilities. How do you really see this play a role in ensuring website accessibility, particularly at the government level?
Well, for local governments, I've always encouraged them to ask their community. The community usually is really more than happy to give feedback. And so they'll test it and, ask the question, what do you want to do, but you can't. And that really brings out the testers. You can have a budget for this too. I mean, you can hire people with disability to test your website. It tends to be a really underemployed of the population. And it really helps to be able to document that you've used human testers who use a screen reader or have disability to uh, to really test your website and make sure that it's accessible. But asking people is the number one way. It's like a cheat code to make sure that you've covered the right things.
I like that. And I think that again involves the public, people who are impacted, which I'm sure makes it somewhat more relevant to involve individuals who are directly impacted by these changes, whether it's positive or, limitations. And so, yeah, now we'll move to the more I would say discuss topic because websites has been around for a little bit longer, but documents matter too. And big part of that is people don't understand where their documents are sometimes. So accessibility isn't just about websites, but we've also discussed PDFs, Word documents, forms, report, presentations. These are all these different formats that tend to be on a public website. Can you, Don, speak to what are key compliance considerations for digital documents specifically?
Well, I'll say this is kind of the last frontier because a lot of governments have either focused on the HTML of the website or worked with a website provider to get there. We've been using PDFs for probably 2 decades. And so a lot of local governments have thousands of PDFs on their website, and most of them aren't accessible. When they first started using it, they started scanning, work into a printer and putting that online, which is definitely not accessible. The
Yeah.
tools have gotten better. I think what a lot of local governments need to begin with is scope. So do all of these PDFs need to be online? And if not, archive them. But secondly, change the way that you're approaching document creation right now and make sure that today all documents that are being created are accessible. And if they're PDFs, make sure that it can work with the screen reader or you can navigate through it. Those sorts of things are common problems with PDFs, but it needs to be addressed. And if you can narrow down your scope, it really helps you prioritize which need to be fixed right away. But the main thing that local governments need to do is design your processes in such a way that anything new that's created is accessible.
Yeah, and that I think that's again one of the pieces that we encounter frequently, which is having a plan for legacy or created content, which includes all these formats that I just mentioned.
Mhm.
But the pathway to consider how you tackle ongoing creation, because again, it isn't just one department creating it, it's typically organization wide. And going back to the point of your initial piece of how there is still a lack of awareness and support from a funding as well as resource perspective, and that's still building up. Again, very fair to say that this is still somewhat recent, still somewhat viewed through the lens of what do we have to do? How do we do it? What are our priorities? But this starts to take a little bit of a backseat. And there are again ways to approach this that includes in my lens awareness training as well as actual planning for born accessible content formats. But again, would you be able to briefly speak to what you see for, I guess, existing documents as well as new documents? If you can just speak to it, because this can be an overwhelming type of, burden for staff or budgets when you're especially trying to tackle both, like building something new, having a pathway for that, but also considering all of the content that you already have that's not legacy that is going to be actively used.
I would say for existing documents, it can be very expensive to make those accessible. A lot of them were created in technology that either no longer exist or you don't have the original document. And so it's important to prioritize and focus, like we said before, of the ones that need to be tackled. But if you have the source document, then that making that accessible and just replacing it is the best way. If you don't, I mean, replacing that content is definitely a way to do it. There are a lot of services that are really good at doing this. You want to make sure that they'll stand behind their work and test it with a human being. But that's been a real game changer is being able to have accessibility experts come in and make those documents accessible. As far as new documents, you said training, which is absolutely a game changer here. Everyone who creates a document needs to know how to create that document in an accessible way. If you do this in the first creation, it saves so much time on the back end. And so training is number one. Anybody who's adding content, particularly documents to your website, needs to be trained. Some local governments are having quality assurance where there'll be someone who looks at every document before it goes online. That's tough. That's tough for smaller governments. So training is the way to do it. Building in practice. A lot of these documents are templates. If you have meeting minutes that you publish, those probably look the same every month. even if the content changes. So if you can build templates and shells that are accessible, you're 70 to 75% of the way there. So using those practices is a really good way to make this efficient and make it effective as where everything you do is accessible.
I agree. And I think these regularly feature in conversations that we have, which is templates. And I think that's one of those easy to fix issues, as well as training. Investment in training at the first level can seem high in terms of time or cost. But then the payoff is exactly what you described, which is when you are undertaking this journey, doing it right the first time makes a huge difference, and it saves you a lot of time and costs later in the process, as well as you are building a culture of awareness and building the right, I would say, pieces to ensure that as you continue down this path of creating more content, that it is indeed accessible and it's indeed inclusive. So I really like that as a very simple but critical plan of action. um, Another thing that comes up a lot is third party content. Obviously, third party contents, whether it's documents or files, appear on government websites. What do you recommend as a standard practice when there are, I would again see this as being a large volume of third party content?
Well, the Department of Justice, one of their exemptions, one of their five exemptions is third-party content. And that's listed and elaborated. I worry about that because it could be a misnomer to where some people think that all third-party content can be excluded. If you have a payment gateway, which a lot of companies do, where I can pay my utility bill, but once I click that link, it takes me out to another site, that needs to be accessible because that's how I pay my utility bill or, anything that I have to settle up with the government. So really it's a matter of if it's again, and I keep saying this, but if it's your main program and services, it must be accessible. But you asked a question about how to deal with that.
Yeah.
If you're going to RFP with a new software provider, include it. I mean, you've got some minimum requirements for anybody you do business with. You absolutely must say that they must be WCAG compliant to the latest standard before you'll even do business with them. It's not something that adds value, but it must be a minimum requirement that you don't even consider any bid for software that isn't compliant.
Great. And again, I think that we regularly see this as part of what we are working through on our own end. We are, as a digital accessibility services provider, we regularly flag instances of third-party content, and our recommendation is to push it back to the owner, the creator of these content pieces, because
Yeah.
ultimately they are, I'm sure, wanting to do the right thing, are wanting to be responsible, and if nothing, wanting to be doing the right business with the right people. So that's part of why we do believe that at least creating a list of what is inaccessible and passing that on to your third party providers is a really critical piece to it, even if it's not necessary entirely for you to have those pieces accessible by law. And I think we are kind of wrapping up the part one of our discussion because we are setting a foundation of this. And I really appreciate your time, Don. This has been really incredibly helpful. And I like what we covered today. I think we did bop around a little bit because there were important topics in all of this.
I think this is a great start. I look forward to elaborating. I think that we can get really into specifics of what local governments need to do. So stay tuned for part two.
Great. Thanks so much, Don. Thanks for your time. And I look forward to continuing this conversation in a few weeks.
Thank you. I do too.
Thank you.